Hello and welcome to our Tips and Techniques videos. I'm Mark Biasotti and we are currently in our advanced modeling episodes. And over the next 30 minutes or so, we'll be exploring how you can increase your skills using some of SolidWorks' more advanced features so that you can be more productive and create higher quality models. So whether you're a seasoned SolidWorks user or a beginner, we think that you'll learn something new in this series. For your convenience, we've listed the topics in the YouTube description that we'll be covering in today's episode, along with a timestamp for each topic in the video. Feel free to skip ahead to any tip or point you want to learn more about. This series is being brought to you by Spanner Product Development, a product development company dedicated to creating positive impact in the world, merging innovation, sustainability, and responsibility to bring meaningful experiences to life for over hundreds of clients. If you want to learn more about what Spanner has to offer, stop by our website at spannerpd.com or email us at hello@spannerpd.com. Now let's get started with this episode of our Advanced Modeling episodes.
Welcome to this Tips and Techniques video series. This is episode 23. Photo rendering SolidWorks Visualize. Now, if you've been following my webcasts, I dedicated episode 21 and 22 to SolidWorks PhotoView 360. I thought it worth mentioning and spending an episode talking about SolidWorks Visualize, which is an additional or an alternate photo rendering program for SolidWorks. Now, I'll be the first to admit that I am a novice when it comes to Visualize, and I spent most of my SolidWorks experience and career with PhotoView, and Visualize is still rather new to me. But I thought it only fair that I spend some time on it and convey some of my observations and feedback of what I've learned about the program so far. This isn't an expert overview of PhotoView. It's not even an advanced tips and techniques. It's just an overview of the program. And perhaps it'll be useful to you to get a novice view of it from my perspective. I'm sure there's many things in it in my webcast I'll probably get incorrect about the program. I'm still learning it. Bear with me. But I'm going to use the same example that I used in my previous two webcasts. That's the Beats Studio headphones, and then take it further into Visualize and see what we can do with it there. So with that, let's get started on this episode. SolidWorks Visualize Standard was introduced at SolidWorks World 2016. It's a standalone rendering product, meaning that it isn't an add-in to SolidWorks, but it's a separate executable that is released with each version of SolidWorks. And it can run separately or in tandem with SolidWorks. Its roots are from Luxion's Bunk Speed Keyshot, a product that existed years before it was introduced in 2016. It's unique from PhotoView in that not only is it a standalone rendering product, it uses your graphic cards, GPUs for previewing and rendering. And the result of that is a much more interactive experience when it comes to setting up your rendering and then rendering it. It can be much quicker also. Its roots go way back to 2002. Dassault Systems and NVIDIA at that point were collaborating to improve the graphics for CATIA. A byproduct of that was also the improvement of graphics for SolidWorks, which will come a bit later. But in 2003, Dassault Systems also partners with Mental Images, and that will become apparent why that's important in a few bullet points down. In 2007, NVIDIA purchased Mental Images. And then, well, if you're not familiar with Mental Images, basically they were really instrumental in creating a library of texture of appearances and textures for the CGI industry, and still are a formidable force for that. In 2008, SolidWorks 2008 introduces RealView. And as you know, RealView is the semi-realistic, real-time graphics that you get in SolidWorks that takes advantage of NVIDIA graphic technology. And at that point, I think it was just NVIDIA. It's since able to be utilized with AMD cards and others. In 2009, Luxion and Bunkspeed split their intellectual property between two companies. Basically, Luxion taking Keyshot, which is just CPU rendering, and then Bunkspeed introduces Shot, which is a CPU and GPU powered rendering system based on Mental Images iRay. In 2014, Dassault Systèmes acquires RTT, and at the same time, they get Bunkspeed with that. And then, of course, in 2016, Bunkspeed is rebranded to be SolidWorks Visualize. So it doesn't take a rocket scientist to kind of connect the dots about how Visualize came to be, especially with existing rendering systems that were already being offered from SolidWorks. So what are the differences in capabilities between Visualize and PhotoView? Well, if you want to just pause the video and study this chart, I won't go through all of it, but basically with PhotoView is a much more mature rendering product, and overall, in its standard version, which is SolidWorks Professional, it has more features than SolidWorks Visualize Standard. But if you are willing to spend another $3,000, you can get Visualize Professional, which meets all of the features of PhotoView and then some. So this graph gives you an idea of how that plays out between the three products. As far as rendering between the two products, they're very, very similar. And I think anybody who is adept at either product can probably produce a very, very similar rendering between the two. There are slight differences. This is a PhotoView and Visualize rendering side by side without any alterations. So the Visualize rendering was a import of the SolidWorks file and then just rendered. And you can see there's subtle differences, but these differences can be overcome by tweaking on the materials. You can see that the dark leather is much darker. It doesn't have as much diffuse or specularity, but that can be altered in Visualize. For me, I mentioned that I was a novice at this, and I still am, but what really sold me was earlier this year, I upgraded my workstation, and with that upgrade, I purchased a Quadro RTX 4000 card. Now this card does near real-time ray tracing, and Visualize takes advantage of that. In fact, this is probably one of the lower-end cards. There's a whole lineup of cards that if you are willing to spend the money, you can get some pretty incredible performance out of Visualize. I purchased the RTX 4000 in the middle of the graph there for about a little under $800. And I think for anybody doing photorealistic rendering regularly, this is probably the most important hardware purchase you could make in the last 5 or 8 years. Because of what it allows you to do and Visualize is just really incredible, and just changes your whole rendering experience. If you're willing to spend 2 or 3 times that amount, you can go all the way up to the 8,000. You can see the difference in performance there is over double in teraflops. Of course, the price is more than double, and maybe 3 or 4 times. I found that the RTX 4000 is just a really great value for the price and what it adds to the experience of using SolidWorks Visualize. So by way of introduction, one of the reasons, as I mentioned before, that I bought this card was for the near real-time ray tracing capability of it. A good test of it is to bring in the Porsche Carrera GT and take a look at it in its environment. So I have this in its environment. This is a pretty large model. There's a lot of detail on it, and it holds up pretty well in Visualize with the RTX card. So if I were to just, let me just change the perspective on this a little bit better, get a little closer in on it. And you can see the denoiser helps quite a bit and is pretty interactive, especially if you were to go into the car, into its cockpit, and take a look at a few things. I think I've hit the extent of it. No, maybe not. Okay. So that's pretty quick to get that kind of detail at that speed, and with this many triangles being rendered. So pretty fantastic that you can do this kind of thing. And then along with that, just experiment in real time with a backplate, for instance. So I'll go over and put in a backplate. Let's put in this one. And then position it so it looks like it's within the backplate. And of course, change our perspective and our focal length so it kind of fits into the backplate scene. Sitting at the side of the road. A little more perspective. So yeah, that's pretty neat. So I'm just thrilled with having this card now and being able to do this kind of thing in near real time. Jumping over to SolidWorks Visualize, here's a session that I just started where I've imported the headphones from SolidWorks in my previous PhotoView session. And perhaps I can take you on a little tour here. The first thing you're going to want to do before you do anything probably is change a few options. One that is probably really important if you're a SolidWorks user is to go to the user interface and drop down to viewport navigation and pick the SolidWorks navigation mode. Otherwise, you're going to get lost in how to move around in your scene. So up here on the top, we have at the far left the kind of visualization that you would see in your preview here. To the far left preview is basically the lowest mode of rendering, which is OpenGL, and much like RealView, it uses some kind of semi-realistic looking visualizations. So let's just go to our default camera here and move around. So next over from it is the fast preview rendering mode, and it has two settings, quality and speed. So you can see there's some differences between them, and it really depends on where you are in your workflow. If you're just setting up materials and assigning them, you might want to have it set on speed, but when you want to better discern what the material looks like, you want to drop down to quality. And also I had the denoiser on, which was introduced a few versions back, which greatly enhances the interactiveness of your session and denoises. And then the third one is accurate. and it's going to take a little bit longer, a little less interactive, especially when panning and zooming and then denoising. But I find that most of the time I can get the kind of visualization that I need before final rendering from the fast mode under quality. Next to that is the selection tool, and I have a lot to say about this because this is where maybe I had to learn more than any other aspect of the product, and that is how to apply selections. So when this product, this headphone was imported into Visualize, you get a number of choices on how to import it. This was imported with the automatic setting, and I also checkmarked appearances. And with that, from SolidWorks, the way that you set up your appearances will be reflected in Visualize depending on what you actually pick here. So part is basically what you would expect. It's parts of your model, but don't be confused with this part with an actual SolidWorks part. It's not. It's what is assigned as an appearance by Visualize. And this is where this can lead to some confusion. I can maybe explain that a little bit better. If you go over to Appearance, because these appearances were set up in SolidWorks, the appearance setting, when the selection is set on appearance, it means that, and also I also find that if you really want to discern this better, drop down over to this view, the real view mode. So if I pick on this part of my product, you can see that the appearance is being applied to many different parts or bodies of the SolidWorks part. And this is what is probably most useful because because you've already made your selections in SolidWorks, you want to start to, if you're going to make some changes in Visualize, you want to be changing the appearance of a group of appearances. Moving over to model, well, that's basically just the entire model, and right now cannot be selected because of the way that I import it, I believe. So you cannot assign appearances to bodies, which I find a tremendous disadvantage in Visualize, because as I said in episode 21, one of the great advantages of using SolidWorks with PhotoView in a part model is that you can assign appearances to multiple parts, or bodies, I should say. If you want to apply appearances to bodies in Visualize, you must first assign that appearance, any appearance, to multiple bodies. And then once you do that and you bring it into Visualize, then by using the appearance selection, you can gather up all of those bodies that were assigned that appearance and change it. So if that hasn't confused you yet, I don't know what will. But anyway, moving on. The next tool is for object manipulation. I actually find it much easier to, instead of using this icon, to go over to the structure and then pick a part, and you can see that these parts are assigned materials, or bodies of the SolidWorks parts are assigned materials, but they do represent different parts. So for instance, if we drop down to the dark leather, and we can hide and show that, which can be very useful if you have to make additional selections behind other bodies, then with that selected, we can go and alter that particular appearance. You saw that in the preview here, these ear pads are very dark. Well, if I were to start to make some adjustments on these ear pads, I could make them appear much like they do appear in PhotoView. So if I just go to the actual appearance, and then if I start to work on the roughness of it and even pull up the IOR, I can get something that looks much better as far as the leather. So just so you know, there are differences between the two, but those differences can be overcome by altering the appearance or assigning a entirely new appearance from Visualize. And then of course, these are preset views, so you can go to any of these preset views and use those, much like in SolidWorks where you have preset views. Next over, I brought in the cameras from SolidWorks. The camera I rendered with in PhotoView is this camera, and if you watch my episode 21 and 22, you saw that this is very similar to that view. You can create new cameras, of course, and I find this probably one of the better advantages of Visualize. I think the cameras in Visualize are much more interactive and simple to use than in SolidWorks. You can see that this camera, we can just simply start to change the focal length away from it and then the perspective. So if I want to get in tight on it and then change the perspective, you can do that very interactively with these two sliders. And I think it's just less is more. It just less control makes it more simple. And then another incredible advantage of Visualize is to be able to do interactive depth of field. In SolidWorks, it is not. In SolidWorks Visualize or PhotoView, it is not interactive, and actually, I think it's poorly implemented too. With Visualize, they do a much better job in that you can pick your focus point on the model, and then you can start to use the aperture and f-stop interactively to find out how much depth of field you want in your shot. So here I've picked this point on the forward ear pad, and you can see it's blurring back by the headband. Incredibly useful to be able to do that interactively, like I'm doing right now. So that's cameras. And then the last tab over here is libraries. So I find this was initially very confusing because I think this should be actually the first tab because if you're assigning materials, you want to go here immediately. And it's actually, I think, a bit confused with, the library is a bit confused with the actual appearances and scene tabs. So the difference is that the appearance tab here are your current appearances that are applied to the part, and then their editing capability below them. Similarly with environments, you have the current environments that are part of this project, as well as the ability to alter them. That's different from the library. The library is basically where you go to get those appearances and scenes. So you drop down first to appearances, and then you have a choice between local appearances and cloud appearances. So local appearances are ones that have been downloaded or are part of the project. Cloud is where you go to get appearances that you have not yet used and you're starting to explore. Like for leather, I might want to look for a different leather than what I have here. So I see that here's a dark leather. I can then download that And when you download it, you get a little check mark next to that particular cloud appearance that's now local. Another thing that bugs me a lot about this interface is the fact that by default you get this small thumbnail appearance, and you really can't discern from the nomenclature what that material is. I think, and I wish that this could be set by default, but if you go down to small list, you get a much more discerning list of materials, because then you can read each of their descriptions along with the small thumbnail. Unfortunately, you cannot, at least I could not find a way to set it up this way by default. I find that by default with the medium icons, it's almost completely useless, because you're just looking at appearances of balls with a truncated description, and it's, when you get this many materials, it's pretty hard to figure out what you want. Anyway, I'm off my rant there. So anyway, in cloud, if I drop down to small list, you get a good number of materials within categories, and those categories range from automotive to plastics, all the way down to wood. So a good selection there. And then any of those can be altered and then saved as your own custom appearance. So that is a very brief overview of the UI of Visualize. And next, I think what I'll do is I'll just import this headphone model into Visualize and show you some of the options that are available on getting SolidWorks assemblies and parts into Visualize for rendering. So I'm going to go ahead and close this and not save it. And instead of just re-importing that, or just opening the scene that I saved, I'm going to open the SolidWorks part, multi-body part itself. So when you do that for the first time, you get a choice here of how it's imported, and you can, the automatic, I think, is default, and by default it's monitoring the file. What that means is that any changes you make and save in the SolidWorks part or assembly, you can choose to accept those changes the next time you're over in SolidWorks Visualize, either while it's in session or when you first launch it and launch that project. You can then determine what you actually want to bring over from SolidWorks. The appearances, animation, that's only applicable if you have professional, cameras, scenes, and decals. And then with that, you actually have some different ways of categorizing or organizing your SolidWorks structure in Visualize. With automatic, it's basically showing, as I did in the last scene, showing it by appearances. You can also do layer and appearance, which gives you a little bit more description about what actual SolidWorks parts or bodies are there. And then there's a number of other ways to do it that, quite honestly, I haven't had the time or determination to figure out how they work and what their particular advantages and disadvantages are. So in this I'm just going to bring in the appearances. I'm not going to bring in cameras because I really would rather set up the camera in Visualize. And scenes also, I'm going to pick some different scenes in Visualize, and I'm not going to bring in decals. Well, maybe I will, and then I'll show you the difference between bringing decals in from SolidWorks versus applying them in Visualize. So let's go ahead and do that. So here we have our model, and you can see that I've placed it on a kind of cherry wood board. If you don't want that in Visualize, then if you go over to the root structure and take a look and find that cherry wood, here it is, satin finished cherry, you can hide that. In addition, you can also suppress it, really. If you have this selected, you have the ability to disable it or make it visible. So you can do that. Let's just not make it visible for right now. So here's our headphones in this orientation. Another thing I find a little boggling in SolidWorks Visualize as far as the default camera is that you get some gimbal lock if you go too far. So here I'm trying to rotate around and rotate over it, but it locks at the top pole, what I would think would be the y-axis of these headphones. What makes that difficult is when you want to maybe render this at a certain angle, and right now I'm trying to pull it down so that I get it laying down, but I can't do that, and that's because there are limitations to the default camera in Visualize. I hope that's something they fix in the near future, because I find it rather limiting to be able to not just move my camera to any angle of my object that I would like. You could just, there is maybe a workaround, and that workaround would be to take the object itself and actually transform it. So lay it down or actually reposition it in the scene. You can do that by just rotating the particular model that you have using these controls. So if I were wanting to do that, I would just maybe rotate the entire model over. So here you see I can just make this 90 degrees. Or I thought I did. Let's see here. Minus 90. Okay. Okay, so now I'm able to lay it down and visualize it that way. Let's go ahead and turn back on the tabletop. And after I've rotated my entire part, both the tabletop and the headphones itself, I'm now able to, view it the way I want with the default camera. Something else that might be important, if you do have a high-powered graphics card like the RTX, whatever version, you might want your viewport to be bigger. By default, it is much smaller than what you see here. If you want to change that, you can go over to Options, 3D Viewport, set up your graphics card to what it is, and then you can drop down in here to whatever viewport size you feel is appropriate for you to visualize. I think the default is something like this, and I find that just a bit small, and I'd like to take advantage of the speed of my card, so I put it into something about twice that size under viewport. So let's go back to where I was, and I think it was something like 960 by 540. Okay. So let's talk a bit about materials. So if we go over to materials and we keep our selection of our project on appearances, let's take a look at altering this appearance, this light satin metal. I'm going to take a look at what I've got as far as my satin metals. Here's the ones that are actually part of what was imported. I'll go over to my library and take a look at metal, and then look for something that might be more interesting or appropriate for this. So I do have a gunmetal here. I think I would like to take a look at a sandblasted metal. So with that, I'm just going to simply just drag that over here and drag it onto my model. And you can see that because appearances were set, it applied it to all appropriate appearances. This is a pretty nice satin metal, and I think I want to go forward experimenting with that. Let's zoom in a bit. The gloss black looks pretty good, but we could maybe do better. So I'm going to again go over to my library under cloud and look for I think I'll look for paint, because paint can be very glossy. So here's a jet black. I think I'll give that a try, and then I drag it again onto my model. And looks like I don't get as glossy a finish as what I did through my previous part. So I'm just do a Control Z, bring it back to what it was, and then maybe just alter my current appearance. Probably a good idea though, when you're working on the model and you're working on appearances, is to turn off the depth of field. Right now I do have it off because it's just a new default camera, but sometimes that can kind of confuse applying materials when you don't get to see them in sharp. So back to working on this appearance. This one is a paint color with a clear coat. If I want to make the clear coat a little more glossy, then I can come in and make that a little more pronounced. I can also make it rough so it isn't as sharp a reflection. So it's like perfectly glossy. It's going to have no roughness to it. But that's in reality not the case in most. There is some roughness there. So there's just a bit of altering materials. If you go to the headband itself, it looks a little light in its diffuse color. I can change that by putting on HSV and bringing down the value a bit to make it a little darker. And if I actually want to colorize it, let's say I want to make it more bluish and bring up the saturation, I can do that. So it's very nice and interactive having the near-time ray tracing to do that. So that's just a little over-pronounced right now, so I'm going to bring down the saturation and bring down the value of that to something like that. So that's a little bit on appearances. I won't belabor the point and go through all the appearances other than one that I know that I need to change, and that is the leather here. And I showed this a little earlier. The leather looks very dark in Visualize. So what I'm going to try to do is to bring down the roughness and then bring up the index of refraction of that. So I get a little bit more reflection. I'm going to make it a little rougher. And one thing it doesn't look like it's coming over from SolidWorks is the actual bump map. So I can go over to the texture and take a look. Yeah, and for sure it didn't, it did get the leather dark, and it did get the bump. You might want to check that whenever you see something like that. So perhaps it's just the value of the texture map. So right now I see it's a UV, and we want to try to get it to be a bit more pronounced. So I can do that by going to the bump map texture, and to be sure, this is where I get a little lost in finding the bump map value. It isn't quite apparent until you click on bump, and then you get the bump strength. So let me bring that up a bit, see if we can start to see it better. Now I still can't see it. Well, there it is. It's starting to appear. But the scale is a bit off. So I want to go back over to the texture itself, and I want to scale it. Again, it's hard to, and I'm doing this without any rehearsal, so I can just show you why this can be confusing. You can try a different mapping technique, although I don't think it would probably improve because UV is probably the most appropriate for these very swoopy shapes. If we go to texture, bump, I would think it'd be under texture mapping. So the ability to, let's just put it in a box mode. I suspect because of UV does not give you the ability to actually change the scale of it because it's using a UV map to do that. If you drop down to one of the other ones, like box, which probably won't be appropriate either, would be to, then you can get the ability to transform and scale it. So if we scale it down, you can see it starting to appear. I really want to do scale all. Like so. And then I can actually get it scaled down to something that is appropriate. It looks like I'm not going to be able to really scale it past this value, so I'll just go back to my UV way of mapping, and then just maybe work a bit more on the appearance to make it look more like a leather. It's looking pretty good though. So I think that just gives a rough overview of appearances and how they're used and applied in Visualize. Let's head over to scenes and take a look at what we can do on that regard. There is a number of great scenes that you can use in Visualize, and one that I've gravitated towards more than most is called Docklands Bridge. Let me drag that into my scene here, and let's turn off the table. And then also, and this is a little confusing because now you're working with environments and backplates. The backplate is still being shown from the older scene. Let me go ahead and just remove that. There we go. So if we take a look at this and just put on our default camera, we have this Docklands Bridge, and I really like this scene because there's a really strong key light coming from the sun over here, but you get some really definitive shadows close in around the object, and I think that makes for some really interesting reflections and highlights on your object. Here you can see the sun reflecting into this high gloss black. You get some really nice colors, warm colors into your object. and you're a bit limited on where you can position things, but still I found that I really like this scene. Of course, there's lots of great scenes, and I'll probably explore more and find more that I like. But as far as manipulation, we can turn back on our table. And another great thing about this scene is it casts a really hard shadow that's very realistic. Then, like in PhotoView, one of the other things you can do that's very effective with scenes is to rotate the scene. So with this scene selected, let me go over to my scene. I can change the brightness, obviously, but under Advance, I can rotate it. So if we rotate it around, and we want the key light coming in from the right, we can do that. Or if we want to keep going and then do some fine adjustments on where it's coming in from the left here, looking at my shadow and kind of interactively seeing how that works, then I can adjust it there. You get the flattened floor just like you do in PhotoView, which in this scene isn't going to matter because I had the tabletop. And that's a 3D object. And again, I'm doing that because I want to reflect some of that warm cherry wood into the actual headphones itself. And then, of course, you can change the brightness and the gamma of the entire scene. You want something that's really, really strong, and you can bump it up. I wouldn't recommend it, or if you do, just do it in some slight increments. And you can change the gamma, which has to do with your monitor on your system, whether it's set, you have a gamma set to it, or you want to make some adjustments. That's about it for scenes. Not much else to really talk about there, other than you can go over to your cloud library, drop down into environments, and take a look at some scenes. And then subsequently, you can also do the same for backplates. So with every environment, you also get a backplates place to go look. So if you go under plates, and again, let's show this by small list. I want to go to Docklands Bridge, and I can load plates into this. So if I drag this in, and I've actually dragged it onto my tabletop, which is not what I wanted to do. Let's try that again. Now I get my backplate. So if I want these kind of lying down on the pavement, I can do that. This isn't particularly the best backplate for that. We can go back to my backplates, and we can do some adjustments to it, but I think we probably have to go grab a different backplate. So let's take a look at another one. And again, it's kind of hard to see because the thumbnails are so small. Perhaps the best way is to just drag it into the scene. So this one again, unless they're huge headphones, isn't going to work very well. And yeah, so those are backplates. Moving on to decals. Under the appearances, we have the decals that were brought in from SolidWorks and just automatically placed in the model. You can see them, the studio, the beats, and the wireless, the right and left decals here. If I want to apply these in Visualize, that's possible to do. Let's go ahead and just delete the studio one and recreate it in Visualize. So I'm going to create a new decal. I'm going to go over and grab the PNG image, and now I can replace it on this face and go ahead and scale it up, rotate it, and you can see that it is currently just applying to one face. So if I want it to be a multi-part decal and extend to more than one face, I can do that by just selecting that one option. And so that's pretty much how you place a decal. Pretty easy to do. One thing you do need to know, though, is if you want to use this decal more than once, you actually have to create a duplicate. You can only have a specific instance of one decal per visualized project. So I'm going to go ahead and duplicate that and just call it Studio 2, and then I can place it here on the headband. But you cannot just grab the same one and place it onto multiple parts. So now that we've applied our appearances and decals, we can move to cameras. And right now I have this default camera that was brought over from SolidWorks. And I think I'll just delete that camera. And recreate a new one. So if we want to create a new camera, we can name it, and then we can go and change the focal length and the perspective of that camera. So kind of mimicking what we had as far as camera 2 in our SolidWorks scene. We have this now as a new camera. And with that, we can also enable depth of field, and we can get our focal distance by just picking an object on the part, and then experimenting with the aperture and f-stop. So of course with a wide f-stop and 0 aperture, you get everything in focus, but that's not possible in real cameras, especially with wide angle. So we're going to come down a bit and give it some depth of field so the back band is blurry and the front of the headphones are in focus. And it's that simple. There's a few more things that you can do. You can actually dolly. You can change the longitude and latitude. You can twist. But you can pretty much do these with shortcut keys like you can in SolidWorks also. So just be wary that by doing that, I've changed my depth of field. So I need to go back and pick my in focus, and then I think I can just leave the aperture and f-stop the way it is. Also, you get some handy tools. You get a grid, which is the rule of thirds overlay, and like I talked about in the PhotoView session, to create more interest, you usually just want to offset the your object from center, so it's in the 2/3, either in the upper or the lower. It also helps, I'm holding down my Alt key to kind of get some tilt into the scene, add some dynamic interest. to do that. Yeah, those are good tools to have. Apart from that, you can create as many cameras as you want. I usually have a render camera, so I would call this my render 1 camera. And then it's also helpful to have a default camera or a setup camera. And this is when you are not worried about the final rendering, but you're just manipulating around your 3D object to set up appearances and decals and whatnot. So usually you can get by with those 2 cameras and then have additional ones if you're doing like a multi-session shot and you want different perspectives of your object. So we've come to pretty much the end of our render process and we're ready to render our image. We set up our appearances and our decals and our camera. We're ready to render. So we can go ahead and click on the output tools and set up the particular format that we want to render out as. I'm going to render out as PNG, and the folder for where you save it, the file name, and then the resolution size. The resolution size can be controlled by the camera also. So we have the render 1 camera, and I believe if you pull down under aspect ratio, you can make it HD or square. I had square on the camera that was brought over from SolidWorks. I'm going to go with HD here, and then go to render, and then I'll set up our location to save the rendering. I'll put it in this Webcast, make a new folder while I'm at it called images. Oh, I'm in the wrong one. I'm over in episode 23, and I'll call the Beats Studio headphones, PNG, and then render. And then some helpful things that you can do in addition is you can control the quality of rendering, and you can do it by time limit. So for instance, if I don't want to spend more than maybe 30 seconds to render this, which is probably not enough time, but for the sake of the webcast I'm doing that, you can do that and set up a time limit instead of just fully rendering it by passes. So passes is the normal mode, and I have here for 1,000 passes. I'm going to put a time limit of 30 seconds on it, and then we're going to start our rendering, and we'll just pause here for 30 seconds and watch what happens. So calculates the scene, and then you get a kind of a time bar in the upper left, and tells me there's 16 seconds remaining, 10 seconds remaining, 4 seconds remaining, and our render is complete. So that's pretty fantastic to get that quality of resolution at HD in 30 seconds, and that's the RTX card, again, greatly contributing to that. If you have the professional version of Visualize and you have animation capabilities, this is where it's really going to shine, because you can cut down on the time of your multiple frames for rendering and do some pretty fantastic stuff. So that's rendering the headphones. So that's my brief overview of Visualize. I'm looking forward to learning more about it and using it more in my product design process. It's been very, very valuable so far to get out some quick renderings, and maybe in the future when I learn more about the product, I can do a more informed webcast, but hopefully you got something out of this. So that's it for this webcast, and look forward to meeting you again online for my next webcast. So long.
Thanks for tuning in to today's episode. We hope what you've learned has been informative and can help you to better use some of SolidWorks' advanced features. You'll see in the YouTube description a link to example models used in today's video. Feel free to download it, and you can explore these techniques at your own leisure. Also, we'd love to hear from you, so consider emailing me at the address you see here on the screen. If you need help on your design project or just want to know more about us, stop by our website at spannerpd.com or email us at hello@spannerpd.com. Take care, and I'll see you in the next episode.